I'm chiming back in just to introduce our moderator. Dr. Brendel, who sits next to me, is the director of the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics and the director of the Masters of Science in Bioethics degree program and an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, and today's able moderator of our very first session. Thank you.
Great, welcome everyone. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first panel today on psychedelics in medical and therapeutic practice. Since we're the first of the day, I believe that we will introduce each speaker and their paper as they go, so we don't waste time in the beginning. And our first paper is from Efficacy to Effectiveness, Evaluating Psychedelic Randomized Controlled Trials for Trustworthy Evidence-Based Policy by Eduardo Schenberg, the president of the Instituto, Phaneros.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you to Popular, Petrie-Flom, and Harvard University. It's a real honor to be here to start the day. What I want to talk to you today, I have 3 takeaway points for you to really write down, note, and reflect after the talk and discuss. So the first point is the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. This is a very important point. The second one is a thing called extrapolation fallacy. And this is something that is very common among people that don't really understand or pay attention to the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. And the third point is that if we don't pay attention to the extrapolation fallacy and the difference between efficacy and effectiveness in psychedelic therapy research and implementation and regulation and approval, we are very likely to create a market that I would say is prone to become a medical reversal. And medical reversal is what happens when approved treatments are later abandoned by being perceived ineffective or even harmful. So the first thing that is important to highlight is that we have, we have RCTs on one side and we have medical practice on the other side. They are not one and the same, and we should never confuse them. So RCT is a randomized controlled trial, right? Randomized refers to the technique of randomization. So you random allocate patients to different groups in your trial. And the C of control there refers to a bunch of techniques, but most specifically and importantly in psychedelic therapy research is being discussed is the blinding thing, the double blinding, and the issue that people realize they got the psychedelic, and then you have the phenomenon of unblinding. So RCTs, what we measure in RCTs is efficacy. And what we want in medical practice is actually to understand effectiveness. They are not the same, and going from one to the other is much more complicated than generally assumed. So efficacy and effectiveness, they are related respectively with internal validity and external validity. Internal validity we can understand as the degree of confidence that we can have that the results obtained in a trial were causally achieved, let's say by the drug under test. And external validity refers to the applicability of the results. Once you got these results in an RCT, will they actually replicate and work outside of the RCT sample in the general population? These are very important concepts, generally mistaken and confused. So in RCTs, what is generally assumed is that things like expectancy, therapeutic alliance, beliefs, behaviors, etc., these are biases and they can confound the estimate of the drug effect, right? So you should use controls like randomization and especially blinding, which is a post-randomization control feature, to minimize this so that you could really consider that your efficacy estimate is reliable. Then the assumption there is that if you have trust in your efficacy measure, you will almost automatically get into effectiveness. If you do a proper randomized trial, if your treatment works in the trial, it will work in the general population. That is what is known as extrapolation fallacy. Why? Because exact these factors that are said to be biases, they are always present in trials to a lesser or lower, more or less intense degree, right? And in psychedelic therapy, it's actually very interesting that these factors, which are trying to be minimized in the RCTs, are very important to maximize results of psychedelic therapy in clinical practice. These include therapeutic techniques, music, touch or non-touch, and many, many other features. It's actually a very long list of possible things here that are related with the clinical outcomes. So what we saw in the recent FDA Psychopharmacology Advisory Committee meeting on June 4th is that they were assuming that you need to get to drug efficacy so that you can extrapolate. But that's exactly the extrapolation fallacy. And we should be talking as well of treatment efficacy, because the psychotherapy also contributes causally to the treatment outcomes, and it synergistically interacts with the drug effects. MDMA, for example, is an empathogen. It boosts feelings of empathy, and it changes how patients are able to relate with therapists, right? So these are not biases in these cases. These are treatment factors. So if we don't get this right, as I said in the beginning, I think we are very prone to see a kind of tragic outcome in, let's say, 10 years of a medical reversal happening in psychedelic therapy if these treatments are just dispensed as standalone drug treatments. Now, for us to get to reliable evidence-based policy and practice, EBPP, we need to really understand how to extrapolate. Now, I'll bring a mathematical equation. Please don't get scared. This is very solid work on philosophy of science by Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Hardy, an excellent book about evidence-based policy from 2012. So this is the formula that they bring, right? And the important thing here is CP means causal principle, right? And you are looking for a causal principle for an outcome, Y in yellow. And the C just represents that this outcome would be caused by everything on the right-hand side of the equation. Then what we see here is that the outcome is caused by a basal level, Y0. So let's say PTSD or depression scores before and after treatment, right? This is Y0 and Y. And this will be caused by a drug, or X, right? But the interesting thing here is that X, or the drug, is not alone in the equation. It is modulated by B. And B are called support factors. Let's say therapy, therapeutic alliance, expectancy, and so on. Furthermore, we have Z, which are support factors unrelated with the direct effects of the drug. So we have two basic kinds of support factors, the related and unrelated with the drug, B and Z. And A1, A2, A3, A4 are modulators or constants. So for different types of drugs, you might have high or low A1, A2, A3, A4. In psychedelics, for example, A3 may be really high, and this means that the support factors have a very important contribution to the treatment effect, right? And perhaps for other support factors as well. What happens in the extrapolation fallacy is that because we assume that randomization and blinding work perfectly to control for everything, we are supposing that A3 and A4 are zero, and therefore B and Z do not matter, and we can just jump from RCT to medical practice, and that's a serious mistake, right? So if we want to avoid medical reversals, I think that we need to better study right now and understand the contribution of the support factors. And pretty much, we have papers showing that therapeutic alliance is important in predicting outcomes in psychedelic therapy. We have papers that they change beliefs. We have papers that music interacts with the effects of LSD measured in neuroimaging. And what's missing mostly is more work measuring expectancy. But expectancy doesn't mean that a trial outcome is invalid. It just means that the clinical outcome was not entirely determined by the drug, but actually by the drug plus other factors, right? So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
All right. So,
10 minutes more.
You have 10 minutes more, okay. And thank you for setting such a perfect model of clarity and brevity to get the day started. So we're going to start now with some questions, and if you could put your card up and maybe angle it towards me so I can call names. All right. Victoria, why don't we start with you?
I'm just wondering.
And please use a microphone if you have. Oh, they're in the ceiling.
I can speak
to the mic in the ceiling.
All right, I'll speak up to the sky. Just wondering, because you framed your research sort of in reaction to the advisory committee meeting, but this was obviously proposed prior to that. So just, I guess, like what gave Rose to advise this question, or sort of, how did it change after that meeting?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a reaction, it's more like an analysis. I've been publishing about this before. So I have two comments out there in peer-reviewed journals, one in 2021 called Who is Blind in Psychedelic Research, and the other from 23 or 24, I think it's 24. So I've been raising these issues before, and this was very striking to me because I was watching the 9 hours and 45 minutes of the FDA advisory session, and it was striking to me how I was seeing live the extrapolation fallacy happening right there. And a committee who do not include any psychologists, any therapists, just psychiatrists and statisticians, right? And the vote of the statistician was pretty interesting, that he said it actually feels strange to vote no when the p-value starts with 3 zeros. And I think the mistake there is that they're pursuing this drug efficacy, supposing that everything else is independent from the drug. But it's not, because we are evaluating their drug that boosts empathy, right, and changes how people feel. So it's actually impossible to blind, and perhaps we shouldn't even be trying to do that, because it really depends on how people behave, on their intentions, and how the relationships between patients and therapists happen during the whole course of the 3 to 4 months of the model that was being evaluated there.
Great. We'll go to, all right, well, first we'll go to Leonard, and then to Phoebe, and then if anyone else wants to go, I have other cards too, so I'll keep it.
Yes, Eduardo, are you familiar with the work of Bruno Rasmussen in San Pablo?
Yes, we worked together some 10 years ago. We published 3 papers about his patients with ibogaine for drug addiction, mostly cocaine and alcohol. And I personally interviewed 75 of his patients, and the stories are amazing. The 3 papers I can share with you later.
Yes, thank you. I thought that would be a good cooperative agreement with you, a collaboration to study his patients coming out of cocaine studies and so on.
Great. Phoebe?
Thanks. I love this paper. I'm totally convinced. And I wonder, how broadly, though, do you think this problem applies? Like, I think of the FDA discussion, like, psychiatry as a whole really suffers, and arguably a lot of medicine, from these issues, but we kind of just function as if blinding is working in a lot of these trials, but nobody's testing for it, and arguably it's not, and you point this out. So
yes.
How broadly would you want to extrapolate your concerns?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this is not particularly relevant for psychedelic studies in general. This is an issue for all RCTs, also in education, economics. RCTs are not just in pharmaceutical development, right? So Nancy Cartwright has been writing about this for decades. She just turned 80, have all awards that she deserves. And this issue has been discussed for far too long. I think the problem is that in the pharmaceutical development sector, there are so many interests outside of the real scientific concerns and clinical care, right? There are financial, vested interests and so on, and conflicts of interest. And the whole business sector is predicated on the idea that you get blinded results, but actually less than 10% of the biomedical literature adequately measures and reports if blinding worked or failed. Many trials were actually blinded failed, And arguably for esketamine, which is already approved in this country, the risk of bias and unblinding is the same as in MDMA, right? And maybe what we're seeing is a double standard, where blinding sometimes becomes a problem, and at other times it's just not a problem. And what are the reasons for that, right? So there's much to be discussed, and I think to close the answer, it's also important to look at the declaration of the Dutch government that a few days after the FDA advisory committee meeting declared that in their view, and they created a panel more multidisciplinary than the FDA advisory committee was, and they concluded that MDMA-assisted therapy is effective for PTSD, and that the Dutch government will work to make it implemented as soon as possible. And the first step will be an unblinded trial before and after treatment with 400 patients. So this is moving forward, and different countries and different commissions are interpreting the thing differently.
Great. Okay. I have Mason, Lewis, Glenn, and Ken. If we get there, we'll go to you. Mason.
Thank you. Your paper is very helpful, very important in pointing out, I think, shortcomings in the current system. My question is about specifically with respect to MDMA or psilocybin, for example. How do we know that all the factors you mentioned cannot be separated out from the drug?
Well, I think part of it is clinical experience, but part of it is also neuroscience. So when we look to the effect of these drugs, and we look to neuroimaging of the placebo effect, for example, which is a concept I don't like very much. I think it's poorly defined and generates much confusion. But psychedelics interact with brain circuits, which are really what the nervous system does with sensory perception, with interoception, proprioception. So it's not only impossible to someone to take a psychedelic and not realize that you're feeling these effects, because they really act on the neocortex and brain regions important for how we behave and how we relate with the environment. So everything a person does under a psychedelic is changed. The feedback loops and circuits in the nervous system are not operating the same way, right? And clinicians and patients and users and indigenous communities, they realized this a long time ago by self-experience. As important as the substance or the sacrament or the drug or the medication is the people around you, is what's being done, is the beliefs, the purposes, and so on. Many patients quickly realize, like, if I was taking this alone, I would be in really emotional trouble right now. So all these factors, they can be studied scientifically. Interpersonal relationships doesn't mean anything unscientific, right? And inclusive, here in Harvard, they will now do simultaneous brain imaging of therapists and patients during MDMA therapy. So there are groundbreaking studies coming up that I assume will support this interpretation that we need.
All right, and I think, Louis, you'll be our last question, given the time.
So moving forward, FDA approval requires the use of adequate and well-controlled trials. Going forward, what advice do you have for developers, drug developers in this area, as to what they should argue an adequate and well-controlled trial is?
They can reach out to me on LinkedIn and we can arrange a consultancy. But I think really the first important thing is that well-controlled is not synonymous with a blinded study. Actually, there are people, as I mentioned in the paper, there's this statistician who says that the purpose of a double-blinded trial is to become unblinded because of efficacy. So if depressed patients feel better, there's no way that they cannot know they're feeling better. There's no way we can know they're feeling better if they don't, right? Because it's all subjective. What's missing really was more transparency and rigor in measuring and reporting these other features, right? But as the regulatory authority, if they show that they behave like if it's unblinded, we're not going to approve your data, people are more likely, I think companies are more likely to not report unblinding And reporting is not even recommended in trial guidelines such as CONSORT. So this is making the field a bit messy, really, because we're not reporting all the features that are relevant in the studies.
Great, thank you. So apparently my yellow light is not working, but we are out of time. Thank you very much. And I think just to sum it up, I think the big question that you're really highlighting for us is not if we have to change the way that we're talking about research on psychedelics in RCTs for FDA approval, but how much should we be thinking even more about the way in which we rely and see RCTs as a gold standard for evidence-based medicine. So thank you very much for helping to reframe our thinking on that. Okay, so our next speaker is Logan Farikoff, the incoming associate at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, and he will be speaking on setting, and standard of care, exploring medical malpractice in psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you to everyone at the Petrie-Flom Center for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to the conversation throughout the rest of the day. So, assuming we see FDA approval of a psychedelic therapy, which admittedly seemed a bit more promising a few months ago when I was writing this, there will still be a handful of legal frameworks that will shape the rollout and implementation of the therapy, one of which is medical malpractice. Now, malpractice is a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, we expect that it will increase patient safety by forcing doctors to internalize at least the costs of some of the injuries to patients. On the other hand, the risk of liability can have a negative effect on decision-making on behalf of some of these doctors. In the most extreme case, they might choose not to provide therapy at all for risk of liability. In a less extreme case, they might only provide treatments to some subpopulations, which will decrease access to others. Most likely, they will engage in some form of defensive medicine, which is essentially deploying medical procedures not to increase the patient outcome, but simply to decrease liability on their side, which will increase costs unnecessarily, again, decreasing access to the therapy. So let me take a step back and kind of lay out what medical malpractice is. It is essentially a claim that a healthcare provider failed to meet some standard of care. That failure to meet the standard of care resulted in an injury to the patient, and the patient is seeking monetary damages to compensate them for that injury. And the million-dollar question, in some cases quite literally, is what is the standard of care? It's a notoriously hazy standard, but essentially what it is asking what care would a reasonable doctor in a similar situation have provided to the patient? Like I said, very hard to kind of ascertain, especially when you realize the answer to that question will be decided by a judge or a jury who in almost every case is not a doctor themselves, which kind of leaves them in this space where in a courtroom they're hearing competing medical opinions from the plaintiff's expert, from the defendant's expert, and they're trying to figure out what is the standard of care. And because it's so hard to know for the judge or the jury, it's very hard to know ex ante for the doctor, which means it's hard to gauge your own liability when you're sitting here thinking, should I provide treatment? And if so, in what manner should I provide the treatment? This ambiguity is exacerbated in novel treatments because there really isn't a foundation of a history of what the standard of care is. You can imagine if there's some therapy that people have been providing for 50 years, you can kind of just look back and say, yeah, for the last decade, everyone has done it this way. This is the standard of care. If I provide care in this manner, my liability will be limited. However, if you have something that's truly novel, it's like a real phase shift in treatment, you don't have this foundation, right? Like in the case of providing a high dose of psychedelics with some form of psychosocial support, there's not really something you can point to and say, this is the foundation of the standard of care. You're kind of at a blank slate, and it's very difficult to start building the standard of care from there. However, to promote safety, efficacy, and access to these treatments, a well-defined standard of care is really important. Like I said in the beginning, malpractice is supposed to increase safety, but at the same time, it can decrease access, and we want to make sure that the standard of care is well defined in a way that promotes all of these factors for patients. So how do we do this? At first glance, maybe the most simple way to do it, and the most solid way to do it would be to have a state legislature just flat out say, this is what the standard of care is for psychedelic therapy. You know, if you check all of these boxes, you have an absolute defense to medical malpractice. States have tried this in the past for a handful of different medical therapies. As far as I'm aware, this has not been raised as a defense in a single medical malpractice trial. It sort of seems like the problem is it's hard for a legislature to write a definition of standard of care that's broad enough that people feel like they're applying it, and at the same time it's narrow enough that it applies to the specific case at hand. So that probably won't work. We are left in this hazy world where we're not sure exactly what the standard of care is ex ante. So I would argue the best way for a healthcare provider to determine what the standard of care might be is to kind of reverse engineer it and think about the courtroom and how will a judge or a jury determine the standard of care? What evidence will they be drawing from? And you can draw from that evidence yourself to try to build up the standard of care ex ante before you have a medical malpractice suit to begin with. So some of the evidence that they might draw from, one, FDA-approved labeling. Now, FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine, they regulate drugs, so they do not set a standard of care. But most jurisdictions will allow expert witnesses to draw on FDA-approved labeling in their testimony, which can kind of form the basis for the standard of care. And you can imagine a doctor who prescribed a drug according to the FDA label has a fairly strong defense to medical malpractice. It's not absolute, and it certainly doesn't bar off-label prescriptions. That is 100% allowed, even under this regime of looking to FDA-approved labeling for determining the standard of care. But it is something that doctors should be looking to as they consider how they might want to administer psychedelic therapy. Additionally, the REMS will be part of, assuming there is a REMS with FDA approval, that will be part of the labeling. It's unclear what the REMS would look like at this point, so it's hard to kind of base the standard of care off of that, but that is another piece of evidence that they should be looking to from the FDA. Another body of evidence comes from clinical trials. At this point, over the last decade, there's been dozens of clinical trials that they can draw from. Assuming the Lykos drug gets approval, you can just look at the Lykos clinical trial. You can say, how were they doing it when they were providing MDMA-assisted therapy? Unfortunately, the therapy component of these treatments are intentionally flexible and vague, which kind of leaves us in the same boat of, well, what is the standard of care if we intentionally left the door open so the practitioners have some room to wiggle? Well, does that say the standard of care is very broad and you can kind of get away with things in terms of the standard of care? Or does that just mean we don't really have a definition at all, which leaves us in the same boat? So that's a problem with drawing from clinical trials, but again, something you can point to and be ready to introduce as evidence should you find yourself in a medical malpractice suit. Finally, and what I think is maybe the most hopeful, are clinical practice guides. Essentially, they are documents authored by various stakeholders in an industry, government, insurance groups, just medical associations broadly, that kind of lay out, it almost lays out the standard of care without being officially the standard of care or holding itself out to be the standard of care. It says, this is how we recommend you do things. Like I said, not the actual standard of care, but can become the de facto standard of care. In the paper, I point to an example of a doctor who is sued for medical malpractice after a patient presented with chest pains. Doctor sends them home after running some tests. Patient dies of a heart attack 3 hours later. Essentially, medical malpractice suit happens, and the doctor is found not liable because everyone in the industry had followed this American Cardiology Association procedure for reading tests. The doctor had followed that. That was deemed to be the standard of care. So if you can point to one of these clinical practice guides and say, this is why I was doing things, this is what I was doing, that can be a pretty strong foundation for a claim that you were abiding by the standard of care. Unfortunately, there's only one so far. Obviously, psychedelic therapy is a pretty nascent industry. We can expect as the industry evolves a little bit, to see more stakeholders weighing in and more guides coming out, and practitioners who kind of just stay up to date and be aware of all these things. So in sum, the standard of care is an evolving concept, particularly for a nascent industry like psychedelic therapy, and various stakeholders are going to weigh in, and they can come together to help shape the way physicians provide treatment in the hope that we can improve patient safety, efficacy, and access. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we're getting lots of questions very quickly. Okay, we'll go to Sarah and then to Glenn.
Yeah, so I enjoyed the paper and presentation, so thank you. I was wondering how much of the problems that you raise have to do with psychedelics specifically, and how much have to do with sort of new developing treatments and technologies that we've probably seen in other medical areas. And sort of given that, how much do you really want to sort of calcify rules, right? So we talked about state legislatures, and that makes me very nervous. Then you talked about sort of standards of care and trade groups, and that seems to me like a much better tool. And I wonder if it's worth kind of weighing those, because presumably, as there's more treatment and more data, the standards will change, right? And you see it in a lot of other standards of reasonableness that change over time. And so I'm just wondering if there's a way to sort of weigh in whether the things you're proposing to protect doctors and also protect patients, you might want to think about that kind of flexibility as we get more information for something that's relatively young in a clinical standardized setting.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly not unique to psychedelics. It is a problem for really all innovative therapies, and the more innovative, the bigger the problem. On the point of state legislatures, I would point out that the safe harbor laws that have been passed do not explicitly lay out a standard of care in a way that implies a doctor who doesn't follow that is guilty of violating the standard of care. It's simply a defense for, if you met these, this is a standard of care. So you can imagine a world where the state legislature lays out, if you do X, Y, Z, this constitutes the standard of care, but a doctor does ABC, points to a clinical practice guide, says, no, this is what I was following, that could still be held as the standard of care. So that is potentially helpful, though, like I said, the safe harbor laws that exist have never been used, so I'm not really sure it's an avenue, and now that I think about it, maybe it should be relegated to more of a footnote in the paper because it doesn't seem like a path forward.
Great, Glenn?
Part of what's so interesting about this case is the interaction between liability related to the drug versus liability related to the assisted therapy, and I'm just curious, when it comes to psychotherapy, my own sense, we have psychotherapists on the panel, is that actually one of the big liability risks is suicidality? Beyond that, actually, malpractice claims relatively kind of rare. So I'm just curious about also at the learned intermediary exception, like how you see the fact that this is a combination between drug therapy and talk therapy playing out because of analogies or case law or stuff like that.
Yeah, I think the problems really do stem from the therapeutic component. And as you point out, it might not be the case that doctors are going to have this massive malpractice liability. The big problem is they might think they have malpractice liability. And once you're in this world where you're worried about malpractice liability, maybe you stay on the sidelines, and then we have this chilling effect at the outset. So it's just important, if the case is going to be that if in the therapeutic context you do not face a large malpractice liability, it would be helpful to just tell them that up front, or like find a way to communicate that to remove some of the chilling effects.
It's kind of interesting because one of the things that we know is there's a huge discordance between poor outcomes, that actual malpractice, and then a malpractice case that actually gets beyond the settlement phase. So one thing would be about claims data, but one of the things that continually comes out about what a protective factor is in terms of malpractice is empathy and the demeanor and relationship between the prescriber or the physician and the patient. So In this case, right, it would lead to a lot of different, it could give you problems on both sides, right? So if you could create lots of empathy, in fact, maybe even blur your boundaries, patients might nonetheless be happy and it might be no quality control. On the other hand, right, if you are setting appropriate limitations or creating environmental factors that influence the therapy in a way that might be clinically appropriate, you could actually be giving yourself a higher degree of liability. All right, Victoria.
This might be a footnote also, but I'm curious if you've thought about liability for facilitators in state legal frameworks, but like let's say you're a doctor, but under Oregon you are not operating under your license, or Colorado's kind of confusing because they might have this clinical, it's like medical practice or not, I'm not sure. But have you thought about those issues related to tort liability?
I have thought about it. I only did a cursory search because I felt like adding on the state legal frameworks was going to just like balloon the paper a little bit too much. And in the cursory search, I didn't see anything that was like directly on point of, oh, this answers what that looks like. But yeah, good point. Maybe something to follow up and slip into a footnote somewhere.
Great, Lewis.
So you and I spoke about this last night, but I just want to mention that another reason not to encourage state interventions, either through statute or regulation, in terms of establishing standards of care, is that you were imagining protective standards of care. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the transgender drug treatment for minors situation now, you had, I told you this already, but Florida, a politically dominated board in Florida basically said that providing cross-gender hormones or puberty blockers to minors is malpractice. And in a fraught area like psychedelics, I can easily imagine other states taking the same path. I mean, well, that state and other states taking the same path.
Right, yeah, just to rehash the conversation, Lewis and I spoke about this at length last night. I think in that case, there is a chance that the state is held to be preempted in trying to completely bar the prescription of an FDA-approved drug, but that's currently being litigated in the Presidente context.
Great, thanks. All right. I think we're going to go to our panelists who have some questions. So Eduardo, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed your chapter. And my question is, if the currently market of esketamine doesn't serve as a model for how is this happening for esketamine? Are there guidelines? Are there any legal processes of malpractice there? And can it inform for other psychedelics in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. Unfortunately, esketamine doesn't have the therapeutic component, which kind of seems like where the most ambiguity is going to come from in the psychedelic therapy context. So there is like, esketamine has the REMS attached to it, so you can assume, all right, well, you have to stay within this realm of what FDA wants, but you don't have any evidence from what happens after you provide the drug to someone, and then what does that psychosocial support look like? The REMS just requires, keep an eye on the person for 2 hours. That won't be that's insightful for the therapeutic context.
But I think the interesting point is that although the RCTs try to say there's no therapy here, many people are practicing ketamine-assisted therapy. So it gets back to my point that RCTs are not the same as medical practice. So maybe there are cases there that could be informative.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll have to try to track that down.
Franklin?
Yeah, I would just share, this is something that's really been on my mind as a psychiatrist working to potentially prepare for the clinical rollout of this at Mass General Hospital. It makes me feel very risk averse that there are no standards to fall back on whatsoever. And I think what's worth thinking about here too is not just the novelty, but the stakes are so high, right? The potential risks of psychedelics gone wrong are far and away beyond so many other novel treatments. New neurosurgeries have other standards to fall back on. So I think the risk is one issue, and the other is the hype. So you have this sort of very potentially high-risk issue colliding with this intense desire for a perceived very positive benefit, and I think it's a very dangerous combination, especially in the midst of a basically total absence of guidelines. So I think this is something really important for hospital risk management lawyers to be thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for the input. It's really helpful to have a first-person insight into how psychiatrists are thinking about it.
I think just to add, to close this out and to add to Franklin's point, really in terms of thinking about this, when you have clinical practice guidelines, they're generally not around just one treatment or therapy, right? So if you're talking about, for example, clinical practice guidelines, not so hypothetically for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, the question would be, if you go the clinical practice guideline route, are you basically saying that you can use, are you boxing yourself into a corner of saying you have to fail this many treatments with SSRI or evidence-based therapies and actually limiting people's access to first-line treatment? Great. Okay, so with that, Franklin's already brought himself into the hot seat, so it's my pleasure to introduce Franklin King, who is a psychiatrist. It's always nice not to be the only psychiatrist on the panel, and the Director of Training and Education at Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Neuroscience and Psychedelics. And his paper is entitled Experiential Training for Psychedelic Therapists, Legal and Licensure-Related Challenges for Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy Training Programs. Franklin.
Thank you. So, yeah, this may seem like a niche area, but I really wanted to wade right into it because I think it's highly controversial in the field, and it's, due to its controversial nature, something that is often left implicit. But within psychedelic circles, including psychedelic research circles, there's a widely held assumption that personal psychedelic experiences should really be a mandate to becoming an effective or licensed psychedelic therapist, and this has really never been explored or challenged. So there's some precedent for this. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, a number of research groups, in the case of the Czech Republic, a government required a certain number of guided psychedelic sessions prior to being certified to working clinically with psychedelics. There's very few exceptions in the modern era due to the DEA regulations around this. Some of the offered rationales for this. First are that the psychedelic experience is thought to be so unique and so intense that there really is a requirement for the practitioner to have a firsthand understanding of what their patients are going to be going through. It's been argued, and there's really no evidence to support this at this point, that the uniqueness of this experience and having a practitioner with personal experience to discuss with their patient would therefore lead to bolstering therapeutic alliance, which we do know is important for clinical outcomes, including in psychedelics, as well as ultimately enhancing other clinical outcomes. Other rationales that have been offered are comparing psychedelic-assisted therapy to other modalities, such as psychoanalysis, psychotherapy training programs in general, which often require a certain number of personal therapy hours, as well as mindfulness training and shamanism, which require extensive personal experience and personal practice prior to being able to offer these modalities to others. Finally, it's been suggested that patients might prefer their practitioners to have had personal experience. There's one paper that I reference in mine that looks at potential psychedelic therapy seekers who do express that they wish their therapist to have had personal experience, but there's also evidence to suggest that the general public will look askance at people who have personal psychedelic experience and actually perceive a negative potential bias with this. So this is far from resolved. There's a lot of thorny ethical issues in terms of building this into therapy training programs. So first, the issue of autonomy of trainees. Psychological autonomy is a really major issue. In psychiatry, we tend to consider psychological autonomy even more critical than medical autonomy. There's special laws for mandatory psychedelic treatments. I think this is something that really has not been considered, that if you're going to have a desire to become a psychedelic therapist, that you're mandated to undergo something that's potentially very risky. There's also issues of who is going to actually be able to become a psychedelic therapist. We know that perceived stigma, partly due to the disproportionate effect on marginalized populations related to psychedelics and the drug war, is one of the major reasons behind why psychedelic studies tend to be so homogeneous and white in their constitution. This could lead to a less diverse population of psychedelic-assisted therapists as well. Additionally, there are many medical contraindications and mild and serious psychiatric contraindications to psychedelic-assisted therapy, and many therapists may be ineligible for this. So this could significantly narrow the pool of practitioners if this were to become a mandate. There's also a risk of positive bias. I think it's coming more into the fore now that psychedelics carry a risk of grandiosity, ego inflation. The therapist might have a very positive experience and then expect that all of their patients are going to have the same experience. And there's also a risk of substituting the idea that a psychedelic experience is enough to make one a qualified practitioner, rather than learning the basics of psychotherapy, which in my opinion are actually much more important. Learning how to manage countertransference, transference in the room, not crossing barriers, which is obviously an issue in contemporary psychedelic research. So we don't want to start substituting psychedelic experiences for just learning how to be an effective therapist. There's also issues with dual relationships. You can't have dual relationships in medicine. If you're treating somebody medically, you can't be socially friends with them, you can't have a business relationship, and they also shouldn't be your student. This is an issue that I think has never come up, but it applies to many ketamine-assisted psychotherapy training programs where the practitioner, who is essentially doing a medical evaluation and giving a diagnosis to dispense ketamine to their student, is suddenly going from a teacher to a physician, and the student is suddenly becoming a patient. And there's issues of whether this is legitimate medical care. If you're going to offer a medical treatment to somebody, you're obligated to provide aftercare. Well, what if you're going to a 5-day ketamine training, you undergo an experiential session on the 4th day, you go home on day 5, and then you're having psychological difficulties from your ketamine. Where's the aftercare? Is this actually legitimate medical care, and are we treating it as such? Finally, I explore the multitude of legal barriers. Even if we wanted to do this, if we thought that this was a good idea, there's a huge number of different legal barriers related to instituting a mandate for psychedelic-assisted therapy training. First is simply the legal status of psychedelic drugs. It really doesn't matter, according to the federal government, what Oregon or Colorado says about legalizing psychedelics. As far as the federal government is concerned, they still remain, with the exception of ketamine, DEA, Schedule I agents. They're illegal to do under any circumstance. So psychedelic-assisted therapy training programs have been looking into the possibility of what if we sent our practitioners, who all carry medical licenses or therapy licenses in their requisite states, what if we were to send them to Oregon, where psychedelics are legal? What if we were to send them to Jamaica or the Netherlands, where psilocybin can be legally accessed? Well, potentially, especially in the case of other countries, that might fly, but what people often forget is the way the state licensure boards operate. For example, I have a medical license through the state of Massachusetts, through the Board of Registration in Medicine. These state licensure bodies have a wide latitude of discretion to enact disciplinary actions against physicians, psychologists, social workers, etc. And this doesn't even need to be disciplinary action pertaining to something that was done in the realm of the clinic. Anything that a medical board deems to be unethical behavior could result in disciplinary action against a license holder. And I think this is a huge risk, that if the medical board does not consider psilocybin in Oregon legitimate, people could be getting in serious trouble when they come back to their home state. There's issues where this has actually happened already. So there's been a number of medical cases on the West Coast where physicians have lost their license for consuming cannabis on a routine drug screen where this has come up, where they've consumed cannabis. They've ended up losing their license, and this is even in states where cannabis has been legalized. So the particular laws do not necessarily align with what medical licensure bodies may end up deciding when reviewing these cases. Finally, some of the other federal legal issues. This goes for people particularly who have a license to dispense medications, so physicians and nurse practitioners. One of the licenses that we have is through the DEA. This is how I'm able to prescribe benzodiazepines and stimulants, for example. DEA licenses are contingent on following DEA regulations and the language of the Controlled Substances Act. And violations of that at the federal level very often result in suspension of a DEA license. And this is not all that happens. It doesn't just take away one's ability to prescribe controlled substances, which is obviously an integral part of a psychiatrist's job. There is a little-known clause, but this affects many physicians, including in Massachusetts, where loss of a DEA license due to a CSA violation triggers another clause in the Social Security Act, where it means that that prescriber can no longer accept Medicare insurance. And this has a very significant effect on any prescriber's career, because if you can't accept Medicare, you cannot work in any hospital that accepts Medicare. So essentially, people become barred, often for many years or for an entire career, from ever working in any hospital. This is an issue that is completely unexplored in the world of psychedelics, so we need to be thinking about this. Finally, thinking about ADA, I explore in my paper the Americans with Disabilities Act. If we are going to mandate psychedelic experiences, and many people, as I already mentioned, are precluded from having them due to medical or psychiatric conditions, this could result in discrimination against trainees. And lastly, from the level of psychedelic therapy training institutions and programs, many educational institutions carry a nonprofit status. They're 501c3. One of the rules around having the privilege to be a nonprofit is that you follow all federal laws. And there have been issues with harm reduction agencies and with organizations that are technically nonprofit getting too involved in the cannabis industry, where they've been stripped of their 501c3 status. So this could also affect organizations if this was something that were to occur. So in conclusion, obviously, I think this is a really pressing issue. This is an issue that is assumed to be critical amongst many psychedelic practitioners, but it's unexplored. There is a rapidly increasing need to understand whether or not this would make a more effective therapist. At present, there is no evidence to support this. I think this carries a very impactful area for future research. And once we do the research, then we can actually start to decide how we're going to solve some of the other problems that I mentioned. So I look forward to questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Hyun first.
Well, thank you for the talk. This is very eye-opening. You mentioned about the example of a psychoanalysis, and it is true. Those analysts, they are required to go through personal psychoanalysis to get certified to become an analyst, right? But one big difference is those analysts, they go through that training along with 4 or 5 years of rigorous training to be certified. So in terms of that requirement, it's quite different, at least as of now. So I was wondering about your thoughts. And the other one is a clarification question. When you talk about psychedelic-assisted therapy, in my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like there are 2 forms. One is more of providing pure psychological support, and the other one is literally providing therapy along the way. So the concept that you're talking about, I wonder which scenario you are thinking of.
So those are both great questions. I would mention one thing I go into in the paper, and I was astounded to learn this because I take it for granted, and I think many in the field of psychiatry and psychotherapy take for granted that having personal therapy experience makes one a better therapist. And there is very little evidence to support this. There's a ton of studies, but they're tiny, they're poorly designed, and there's really not any evidence to support that psychotherapy training ought to have a mandate for personal therapy experience. The evidence that's out there suggests more that the type of therapy and whether it's helpful for the person or not is what has more of an impact on patient outcomes, right? So I think the other question, and I alluded to this in my conclusion, which is really important that you raise, is this issue scratches at the deeper question of what exactly psychedelic treatments are. And this is a major thing that we're sort of dealing with, and a lot of the conflicts around psychedelics right now stem from this question of, is this a psychotherapeutic treatment that happens to have a drug that's added to it to catalyze a therapy, or is this just simply psychopharmacology? And I think if it was simply psychopharmacology, probably the push to have people have personal experience would be significantly reduced. I didn't have to take antipsychotics or stimulants as part of my psychiatric residency, and that's not been something that anybody's thought is helpful for psychiatrists for many years. So I think it really kind of gets at the conceptualization of what PAT actually is.
Other than the fact, of course, that as you put in the paper in the history of this, right, there was some thought that maybe psychiatrists could really understand psychosis better, right, if they engaged in, if they took psychedelics for that experience. Okay, we're going to go to Amy and then to Christoph.
Yeah, thanks, Franklin. So totally by your argument that there should not be mandated personal experience. I think a lot of people have argued that and said, but it should be offered. And I had, I guess, a couple things in sort of what is the main issue here? And one of the issues that you brought up is around sort of like, does this improve your practice or does it bias you as a practitioner? And so I guess part of that is if it's going to be offered, is there sort of a minimum amount of experience you ought to have, right? So some people would have argued and would argue that if you have one experience, you're going to think all experiences are the same, and we understand that psychedelic experiences vary, and so having many experiences might actually bias you less. So maybe we should be worried more about the practitioner who has a little bit of experience, but less worried about the practitioner who has a lot of experience or no experience from a bias perspective, right? I guess my other question is, or related to that, is even though you're arguing it shouldn't be mandated, do you think it should be prohibited? And what would be the argument for saying you shouldn't be able to have psychedelic experiences, or it should be discouraged or whatever from practice? If you're going to take the middle ground and say it should be allowed but not either mandated or discouraged, then should we leave it up to patients to decide? Do I want a therapist? Should you have to disclose that during the consent process and let patients decide if they want a therapist with experience or not, or how would you manage that?
So I think, your first question is a really important one, which is, is one psychedelic experience sufficient, or should there be many psychedelic experiences that could help someone actually have a more grounded understanding of the psychological terrain of psychedelic experiences? So that's obviously a completely unsettled question, but I think it would stand to reason, given the behavior of certain people after their first exposure to psychedelics, that repeated and perhaps as an ongoing process during the course of practicing psychedelic-assisted therapy, that occasional guided psychedelic sessions would be much more effective than even building it into a training program at all. I don't know where my actual opinion lies here, because I think there's so little evidence to answer the question in the first place. But even if there were huge studies that showed that personal psychedelic experience made much more effective therapists and improved clinical outcomes, there's still all of these other legal barriers to doing it. So I'm curious about this question. I wanted to pursue it because so many people privately will admit that they believe that this is something that should be done, but nobody publicly talks about it because it's controversial, and therefore nobody even studies this question. So it's sort of this secret within the field that many people privately believe, but nobody's talking about it publicly and nobody's actually studying it. I don't think that it should be something that should be prohibited. But it's certainly possible that a large study could show that psychedelic therapists who have personal experiences are worse therapists. I think that's really unlikely, but we certainly can't say that at this point. In disclosure, I think personal disclosure is tricky in general in psychotherapy. Classic psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy, one discloses very little, right? Because the idea is that you sort of want to be a blank slate for the patient. So I think disclosure is an interesting question in terms of this. Even if you had psychedelic experiences and patients knew that this is a possibility, would this be something that you would want to disclose or not? Because that could distort what the patient thinks of the practitioner one way or the other.
Yeah, if you haven't seen Brent Kios's article on this, you should read it. He argues against personal experience. He's a psychiatrist ethicist, and he basically argues that it negatively biases in a way that it should be, I don't know if he says prohibited, but discouraged.
Okay, Christoph.
Yes, thank you very much. I would just like to share some European views on this. Perhaps I just come from a workshop in Switzerland with Swiss therapists who have been doing this for almost 10 years now, and they're very explicit as far as I see about self-experiment. Physicians should have it, and they would be very, I think, open to talk about it. I think they even have official guidelines stating this. And there's a practical legal, let's say, workaround that they do, and perhaps it's a creative avenue that might work here as well, and that is they are just doing a research study, and the research question is, how does taking psychedelics affect the therapist's work, as self-experiment up to the therapist, and in order to have a high number of therapists work with psychedelics can enroll, so everybody can participate in that scientific study, and that at least work under the Swiss leadership, and perhaps if you have an open regulatory system in one state, that might be a proceed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Switzerland has sort of managed to work with psychedelics in many different ways over many different epochs without sort of the amount of controversy that we seem to repeatedly generate in the United States. But Nicholas Langlitz, who I think was at the workshop that you just came from, has written about this, and as well as the longer tradition of self-experimentation in both Germany and Switzerland going back to the 1960s. And whereas that was something we did a little bit in the 60s here, that was something that persisted much longer in Switzerland for probably just different cultural attitudes and legal structures. Good point.
We're running a little ahead of schedule, so why don't you take the last questions that are up, even if we go over the time a little bit.
Okay, great. And I'm sorry, your name is blocked in the corner, so I can't. Nishay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for the presentation. I was just curious because I feel like the conversation about the practitioner experience that I've seen largely overlooks another components to direct experience that intersects with grandiosity but is somewhat distinct, which is what I've been talking about in terms of the therapy cult aspect of the field, and that like a lot of the personal experience, the conversations at the level of therapy, and this is how you see how the therapy is done. But in many cases, what is being called psychedelic therapy by certain groups is actually more about practices that encourage bonding to the group versus therapeutic outcomes, and also esoteric aspects of the protocol that are not put to paper people are inducted and initiated into a spiritual tradition that does not necessarily have evidence base for therapeutic efficacy, and that's actually being that there's like a loophole for this transmission of lineage through the way that we're talking about experience of therapy. And I just think that that's an important component of the conversation to be having. So I was curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. One thing that I'm particularly interested in is what are the values and politics and deeply held beliefs and ideas that people project onto psychedelics. And I think both opponents as well as proponents for psychedelics often have tacked on a lot of personal beliefs and opinions about what psychedelics do that actually have very little to do with psychedelics per se. And I think you're speaking to a lot of sort of hidden, covert hopes and dreams of spiritualizing humanity and things like that. And I think some of the components to that are problematic in and of themselves. Some of them are not necessarily bad, but what the problem is that they're not made explicit. There's sort of, psychedelics are being used as a cover to roll in all of these hidden values. And I think if people could clarify what their beliefs are about psychedelics and separate those from just psychedelics, that would actually lead to a much more healthy debate in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about psychedelics. If you have a conversation about psychedelics with just about anybody, you're going to be talking about a lot of stuff that is not about psychedelics.
Great. Okay, I had seen a couple. Lewis is the only one still with his card up, but if anybody else wanted to jump in, I do have Phoebe and Victoria on the list also. So Lewis, why don't you go ahead?
So there's another fascinating legal issue that you might incorporate into your analysis. There's going to be extreme pressure to somehow or another get provision to therapists of psychedelics on label for FDA purposes. Now, obviously, it could be prescribed off-label, but for DEA reasons and malpractice reasons and stuff, there are people who are saying it should be on label. But it would be an extraordinary indication to have on label, because basically what it would be saying is this is a drug that affects the structure or function of the care provider in a way that will ultimately help cure the disease in the patient. And I have thought about any analogy to that in FDA world? And I haven't thought of
There's
one.
none.
There's none. I mean, I thought of like, some kind of robotic surgical things affect the structure function, but not in the same sort of way. And so I think that would be a novel approach to FDA labeling that itself presents some interesting issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see that anytime soon, that the FDA would grant basically for an education and training purpose the dispensation of a drug. But it's related to what I was talking about with these ketamine programs. And I think a lot of people just sort of blindly assume that once we get FDA approval of MDMA and psilocybin, that we're just going to be able to have training programs where we're giving trainees psilocybin and MDMA. You can't give someone an FDA-approved drug without entering into a treatment relationship with them. A lot of ketamine programs sort of skirt this, and they diagnose people with adjustment disorder with depressed mood in order to give ketamine. But these are really, they're dangerous practices, they're questionable practices, they're basically creating a medical situation that may be fictitious in order to dispense a drug for educational purposes. And I think that's really problematic, and that problem is not going to go away once we have, Schedule III psilocybin or MDMA.
And what's new is old, because adjustment disorder, of course, was the go-to billing code for psychoanalysis and psychotherapy for psychiatry trainees. So there we go. All right, Phoebe.
Thanks. Thanks for this great analysis. It's so helpful to see it laid out. I'm thinking again about, the early discussions like Osmond saying, we really ought to all be trying this. It can help promote empathy. But of course, he's working within this psychotomimetic model. And it's so interesting to imagine how that impacted things when he's telling his trainee, all right, here comes psychosis. Like, you're going to dip into it. And it's so different than the models of what is possible so many clinicians are working with today. And then if we think about like clinicians and guides more broadly, they're working with very, very different models. But that makes me think, you raise this really important word about positive bias or other kinds of bias, but I don't know, it feels inevitable regardless of experience that there's, models, framing, biases in that relationship, regardless of who you are as the guide or clinician and whether you've had personal experience. So I don't know, does it dissipate the worry a bit, or just?
I think, you're never going to have a bias-free clinician. There's all sorts of biases, and I think part of, the argument for having personal psychotherapy experience is that you learn to deal with your biases. You learn to know what they are, what your personal trigger points are, so that they don't get in the way of psychotherapy. I think for many people, psychedelics can introduce a pretty powerful bias. And, again, I'm fairly neutral on this at this point, but it's a discussion that's not being had. We're not talking about it openly, despite the fact that many, if not most people working with psychedelics have sought out personal experiences and probably will continue to do so. So I think whenever there are secrets, right? This is the old AA adage, you're only as sick as your secrets. When there's secrets, there's problems. So what is happening needs to be discussed, and then we can look at it in the light of day, and then we can study it. But if we're not talking about it, we're not going to be studying it, and it's going to generate problems.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Eduardo, Logan, and Franklin for bringing us to such a thought-provoking and stimulating beginning of the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Moderator.